Good evening and welcome to DiEM25 UK's YouTube channel, where tonight we're going to be talking about public media reform and what we can do and why we need to do it. And to help us talk through that, we're going to have author Tom Mills, author of BBC, Myth of a Public Service. And he's going to be doing a short presentation followed by questions and answers, which we want all of you to put to us. Just use the chat and we'll put them to Tom, and me and Tom will discuss that afterwards. But without further ado, we'll let Tom get started with his short talk, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Okay, cheers, Alex, and thanks. Hi to everyone. And yeah, I wanted to talk about the future of public media. I think we're at a really important moment, and I want to talk about what I think we should be doing, what's important about the moment we're in, and what we should be working towards. But before we do that, I think it's useful to sort of frame the discussion in terms of how we got to where we are, what is the particular juncture that we're in now, and what's led us to this moment. So I guess usually when I talk about the BBC, I sort of start off with a few kind of provisos as to what I'm generally going to be focusing on. A lot of my work has been on news and current affairs, looking at the BBC, how it reports, what its patterns of reporting are, and how do we explain that. Now, to sort of backpedal to how I got interested in this work, I mean, really, I was starting from what we know about the BBC from existing research, which, again, like there's been really a lot more research since I started researching the BBC. But even at that time, there's a very substantive body of work going back for several decades, looking at how the BBC and how, of course, other media organizations report. Now, there are different kind of theoretical models that you have to explain those things. And in a way, what I wanted to do with my work on the BBC is not look at how the BBC reported, which was not what my research was about. It was looking at why it was, what are the driving forces for the way the BBC reports. So what do we know about BBC reporting? Well, the overwhelmingly, if you watch BBC News and current affairs, you will find that the perspectives of powerful interests in society tend to predominate and tend to be framing the discussion. You can measure this in a number of different ways. You can look at who gets to appear in particular news programs. So you could do a source-based content analysis. Who appears? Who are the talking heads on the programs? You could look at the arguments that appear, and you could try and relate that to the interest in society and try to get a sense of, okay, what are the different arguments in society about how issues should be understood and covered, and then relate that to certain interests. Now, however you do this and however you cut it, the findings are relatively consistent, and not just on the BBC, on really any large media organization. I think as consistent as anything that you find in the social science, which, as I mentioned earlier, it tends to be powerful interests that predominate in news coverage, in discussions of current affairs. The sort of marginal interests in society, interests like civil society, trade unions, the interests of workers, and so on and so forth, black and ethnic minority people. It's not that these perspectives don't appear, it's that they tend to be relatively marginalized by those elite interests, right? So that's the overall pattern, and that holds for newspapers, and that holds for broadcasting. Now, in the case of the newspapers, why it is that the dominant interests in society, or the ruling class, if you want to call them that, whatever kind of term you use, tend to predominate, it's not really that mysterious. I mean, the basic reason, if you look at the structure of these institutions, is that these are capitalist organizations, right? They have a particular type of business model, which is based around advertising. The commodity that they sell classically, newspapers, has been to sell their readers to advertisers. They tend to be parts of large corporations. Now, how that played over the course of the 20th century, and most of my knowledge of this area is based on the UK, but it applies in different ways to different organizations. The picture's not so different, although we can talk about how things might be different in different countries in Europe and the United States and the global south. In the UK, there was a relatively balanced press in the post-war era. The conservative press tended to be supporting press tended to be much larger. Over the course of the 20th century, there was a shift away from, as there was a series of corporate consolidations under market pressures, where the left-leaning elements of the press were basically crudely gobbled up by right-wing conglomerates, and you had the arrival of Murdoch, and then existing right-wing titles, the Daily Mail, the Express, the Telegraph. And we end up with a situation where, with the rise of Thatcherism, the rise of neoliberalism, there's also a parallel shift that takes place in the political economy of the media, particularly from the late 60s and the mid 1970s through the 1980s. So what you have in the press, in the capitalist press, is a highly partisan form of media and communications. Now, the public service broadcasting, the tradition of which the BBC is part and actually pioneered in a lot of ways, is an important kind of alternative to that, right? And what I was trying to do with my research was try to make sense of the patterns of reporting that we find in the BBC, given that its model is quite different. Its model is based on the idea that an organization should be independent of the state and should be independent of private interests and should represent the public interest. Now, what that means in practice is a bit of a complex question, but that's basically how the BBC conceives of itself. That's how many people conceive of the BBC. What's the reality? Well, my book that I wrote on this, which there's a paperback edition, a revised edition coming out in the autumn, was looking at what we know about the BBC, not what we like to imagine the BBC does, but what does the evidence actually tell us? If we actually look at empirical evidence, what do we then find? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we consistently find that the BBC tends to not be critical of governments. They tend to reflect official perspectives, and they tend to marginalize less powerful interests in society. Probably a few years ago, I'd have to persuade people of this. I think now we reached a point where people sort of intuitively understand that that's the kind of organization the BBC is. I mean, it's partly because it's been pulled to the right by successive conservative governments. Now, where we are with the BBC and how do we get to where we are today? Well, number one, the BBC, in terms of the structure of the organisation, has always been very, very close to the British state. It's always been an organisation which is embedded within British officialdom. So from day one, I talk about this in quite a lot of detail in the book. The BBC occupied this kind of grey area between the state and civil society. And it was this kind of negotiation whereby the government realised it would be useful for the BBC to appear independent, because then it would be more useful as an organisation which actually wouldn't enact its reporting in an impartial fashion. That was basically the lesson of the general strike, and I can talk about that in a bit more detail if people are interested. But the basic thesis of the book, and I've never read a convincing refutation of it, is that the BBC has this kind of quasi-autonomy where it always has to go back to the state. It always has to exist in this precarious situation where it needs to, where number one, the people at the head of the BBC, the people on the board, are appointed by governments. Number two, the source of revenue, the BBC's main source of revenue, which is the licence fee, although it's said to come from the licence fee payers, is in fact controlled by government. Number three, the BBC's charter is renewed periodically. It used to be every decade, now it's every 11 years, right? And we're in a new charter period, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end. That's very important. The BBC basically has to go back to the government of the day, renew its constitution, if you like, and its right to continue to exist, basically. So you have this like organization that's very influential, very politicized. It's also populated by people at the top, paid enormous amounts of money, who are, very comfortably in the 0.1% of the UK population in terms of their income, come from very similar backgrounds to other parts of the British elite in terms of their educational and class background. So that's the nature of the BBC. It's essentially part of the establishment. It's arguably even part of the state. It does important things which we would, I think, want to preserve in terms of future democratic media. It's much more professional in terms of its reporting. It's much more accurate. than, say, the Daily Mail or the Express, which is why if you ask the public whether they trust the BBC, quite rightly members of the public will say, yes, I trust the BBC more than like the Sun or the Express, and these newspapers which are basically just a joke and have no journalistic standards whatsoever. So that's not particularly surprising. The BBC has a very different regulatory structure. It has to show due impartiality, which means when stories aren't to do with like the left or the Labour Party, it tends to report accurately. But of course, particular context will be influenced by particular interests in society. But usually, if the BBC says something happened, or says that someone said something, that will be accurate. So that's similar to other professional liberal organizations like the New York Times. It's not that they're giving you an unbiased perspective on the world, but usually they will be giving you a sort of accurate account of what happened with particular context and information omitted when it starts to sort of relate to interest in society. So, you know, if you want an accurate context on a foreign policy issue that like touches on the interests of the British state, obviously don't watch the BBC. But on other elements of like international reporting, you know, you're usually going to get better coverage than you would from other news organisations that aren't so well resourced and so on. Okay, so that's the BBC as it is. There are things which inhibit journalistic freedom at the BBC. There's a centralization of the organization. There's the fact that it's predominantly based in London, which creates this kind of symbiotic relationship with the political elites there. There's these ties that bind the BBC to the government of the day. There's the broader sort of formal culture that goes on. There's a whole other process of change and an embodiment of values that happened at the BBC, which is a significant focus of my book, which was really the key puzzle that I was interested in answering when I started my research. When I first got interested in the BBC, I was going to look at the structures of the BBC, its prevailing culture, and how it is that it tends to report in this fashion. Why is it that a public media organisation comes under particular pressure and this particular culture tends to prevail? So trying to get under the bonnet of the BBC and understand it as a machine, if you like. That was around 2008 when I first started my research, and that was when the original financial crisis occurred. And at that point, I sort of pivoted towards another question I thought which is interesting, which is why is the BBC so pro-business? How did this happen that a public media organisation doesn't ever represent the interests of workers, doesn't even seem to represent mainstream macroeconomic discussion at particular points, that it tends to be the interests of the city and the interests of these right-wing interests that predominate in economic coverage? Well, the short answer to that is the BBC went through a very radical process, a politically driven process of change from the 1990s up to the noughties, where it became much more marketized, a very deliberate process of cultural change, where trade union and labour journalists were pushed out, where the BBC was much more integrated into the capitalist market, where an internal market was set up. So in the same way, this will be familiar to people who work in the public sector or work at universities, where the buyer and seller relationships were created within the organization. And this was all very conscious process of political change, by the way. And also that the business journalists were literally just brought in from the private sector, whilst labour journalists were pushed out. So there was a process of cultural institutional change at the BBC, very deliberate, that meant that a statist organisation, which was very poor on issues of foreign policy and so on, always tend to reflect establishment interests in society. At this point, not only became a sort of establishment statist organization, also became an establishment statist neoliberal organization, and that had really significant political consequences in terms of how the last 10 years has played out, in giving a free hand to Cameron and Osborne, entrenching the crisis of austerity, leading to the series of political crises which we've seen in British politics. So that's all been very significant in the context of what's happened in Britain. Now, the moment we're in now, we can talk a bit about, you know, how we think the media plays a role in reporting of the current pandemic and so on. In the background of that, though, in terms of the role of the media, we've had the rise in the last 20 years of these enormously powerful corporations based in Silicon Valley, which are basically taking over our communicative infrastructure, the ways that we understand the world and communicate with each other, in the same way as, you know, radio and television had this incredibly transformative effect, and the way that played out in terms of the powers of power of the working class and capitalists had very different implications in different polities. We had the BBC when we stumbled on that almost by accident in the UK. The United States went on a very different trajectory. The dust is going to settle on a new system of media and communications. At the moment, we have this sort of jostling between different sections of the elite, what these days gets called the legacy media, so that includes broadcast, but also the newspapers and these big platforms. Now, the business model of what's called the legacy media has gone into crisis, basically because of the shift towards digital, which has made advertising revenue much more difficult when they have to compete with Google and Facebook, which have very sophisticated means of monitoring us and packaging us up into different demographics that well, not even demographics, that's the sort of old language of marketing, but into different clusters of consumers that they can then target on behalf of other corporations. And so there's two basic business models which prevail at the moment. Number one is the paywall, and number two is the monetization of users, which is this sort of a new version of the kind of model which the old press operated out of. Now, where does public media fit into that? I think it's really, really crucial that for all of us on the left and all of us who share democratic public values, that we need to be responding in a way in this crisis which is making a stake not on preserving the institutions of the 20th century, including the BBC, but a stake on our digital future, which can think about a digital infrastructure which isn't owned by unaccountable corporations in Silicon Valley, but has public values embedded into it. And what I think is interesting about the digital space is that actually a public model, despite the fact that what the right wants to argue now, and what you would have seen the Conservative government arguing here, is that technology has changed and that therefore the BBC needs to change and public service is an old model and so on and so forth. Now, public service on the status model is old and outdated, and I think we need to move beyond that. But the idea that public media is necessarily ineffective, inefficient, old-fashioned is just complete nonsense. Actually within the digital sector, it's a very efficient method of production and distribution, because if you fund things publicly at the point of production, there's no need to monetize the content, so you can just let it distribute throughout the internet, zero marginal costs. So in terms of getting bangs for your bucks, the public production and then freely available content, audiovisual content, is a very good and very effective and very efficient model. The other models, which basically involve monitoring users, which necessarily involve an invasion of privacy. I mean, we absolutely should regulate Facebook and these platforms, but the idea that you can make these platforms good, I find kind of absurd, because their entire business model is based on monetizing what we do and trying to nudge us in particular directions to do certain things. I mean, they are advertising machines. That's what they're designed to get us addicted and to behave in particular fashion. So what I think we need to be thinking about is, how do we build a different model? Now, where do I see the BBC as fitting into that? We need to reimagine the BBC in the UK here. And this isn't just a parochial issue for the UK, because the BBC was a very influential seminal broadcaster internationally, which then became a model for public service broadcasters in Europe and around the world. And I think if we can transform the BBC and develop it into an international network of public media organizations, we will be able to then develop different sort of platforms and different sort of public democratic infrastructure, which will be very different to the sort of stuff which is coming out of Silicon Valley. So it's not just about the BBC, but the way I'd like to imagine the BBC being developed is, basically, we've got a charter period now, which is going to last until 2027. There's a mid-charter review. I can talk about that in a little bit more detail. But we have a few years now to win the argument on public media, and the people who run the BBC are not going to do this for us. They recently announced that Tim Davie, who's the new Director General, he's a former Conservative councillor, he's a former marketing manager for Pepsi Cola, he headed the BBC's commercial operations, he's got no background in programme making, he's no friend to public media, and the people at the top of the BBC anyway were completely uninterested in innovation. What we need to be doing is winning a public argument for digital public media, not broadcasting. Broadcasting is dead. We need to think about audio-visual content, publicly funded. Why do I think we need to have a public broadcaster? Because it's not enough for us to have voluntary alternative operations on the left. We need to be thinking about how do we have the public resources that can then be democratically channeled towards an infrastructure which will create alternatives for us, which will be able to act not only as the counterweight and an alternative to these private platforms. And this is hugely important. So I would see the BBC basically as being reformed into a devolved and democratic platform, which would have all of its political influences removed. So the BBC shouldn't have governments appointing the people who head it. It shouldn't have governments being able to control its funding. It shouldn't have governments having to renew its charter. It should be put onto a statutory footing. It should be devolved to the localized level, so that the regions and the nations will be producing content, news content, removed from Westminster, which then feeds into a universal platform. And ultimately, the vision here would have to be creating then partnerships with public media organizations elsewhere where you could share culture and content. And the vision of this has to be very, very different to what the private vision of media is, which is that basically you take culture and information and you either put it behind a paywall or you use it as bait for attention, which will then allow corporations to then try and sell us things, which are basically increasing commodification and corporate power and driving the world off a cliff. So I think we have to think about media reform as part of a wider system of democratic transformation. We have to think of the BBC as part of a democratic response to the digital sector. And I think this has to involve other elements like the British Digital Corporation, or cooperative as my friend Dan Hine calls it, which would be a tech innovator in the public good, which Corbyn talked about in his McTavish lecture 2 years ago, which would be part of this democratic claim on the future. And this will address two problems, right? Number one, this reform BBC I'm envisaging would deal with problems of political bias and lack of impartiality and sort of elite capture of the BBC. But number two, it will deal with this really important long-term problem of big tech, which is currently buying up our future, essentially, right in front of us. That's what's happening. And at the moment, we just don't have the capacity or the resources to have a response to that. This is a medium-term project. If we don't do this by 2027, I'm absolutely certain there will be nothing left of the BBC to save. So for the next few years, I'm going to be talking to people like you, trying to persuade you that this is a really crucial part of any program to build a more democratic and humane future. We can't think of the media and communications as being a simple add-on to a process of democratic transformation. It has to be part and parcel of a whole offering that ties together the various values, I think, which need to bring together any kind of transformative political movement. So I think I've gone on for about 20 minutes or so. So I guess I've sort of wrap things up there, and maybe have a chance to have a bit more of a sort of dialogue and discussion if Alex thinks that's a good idea.
Yeah, I'm good for that, Tom. Thanks for that. It was really broad and informative. And here's Tom's book, which you can get at all good booksellers. Verso, if you look them out. But I'm sure if you just Google it, you'll find it. And it'll always help Tom out, of course. So we've got a few questions that have already been put while you've been giving the chat. So, and one of them, which you just talked on, is about the big tech, and this is probably quite important to it, is the question came prior to us going live. It was, virtually all digital means of communication are owned or originate in the United States. How do we promote the creation of a European, or at least non-US platforms? Which is a good point. What with Facebook and Twitter, they can shape news. Like Twitter's trending tab does shape news, and it's something we do need to change. So what?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of touched on this towards the end, but I mean, the simple answer is that I don't think we can look to European or UK private platforms as ever going to be able to offer any kind of viable competition. I think what you'd need to do there is you'd have to develop a consensus around first of all, regulatory restrictions on US tech giants in combination with an investment in European-wide, and well, I mean, I guess the UK's relationship to Europe is all a bit up in the air. But you would have to have, I think, Europe would have to be at the core of innovation in this area, and I think it would have to come from the public sector. And I think also you'd have to have a degree of sharing of technological development in a way that you wouldn't normally have in the private sector. So the way I think about public digital innovation would be similar to sort of initiatives which you see on the internet in terms of like, open source coding and creative common licenses and the rest of it. A lot of the restrictions of these platforms is basically that they have to monetize content. So as I mentioned earlier, like that you either have to have platforms, you have to monitor users. We will have to have governments that are willing to invest in a public technological innovator. Now, I think if we have enough resources behind that, that could be a real appeal for people who are interested in working in tech, who actually don't want to create these sort of mindless, stupid platforms, and would like to do something interesting and innovative. If we can offer them enough money, we don't need to make them disgustingly rich or anything like that, but I personally would be perfectly happy with creating in a few European capitals a public sector innovator which would pay coders and techie people to develop technology in the public interest, which wouldn't make them into billionaires, but would give them a comfortable life and a nice flat somewhere. But the resources that they then produce, instead of being monetized through a rush towards monopoly and investment of venture capital, would simply be asking, what could we do to make people's lives better, right? How could we do that? And I think that would create a whole different sort of set of incentives and different kind of working culture. The other thing I would say is that when you start new organizations and you throw resources at them, that tends to produce creativity. So if you look at literature on innovation, you can structure companies in such a way where they become very, very innovative, but it doesn't tend to be markets that create that. What tends to happen is either you have a sort of slightly eccentric CEO who just like badgers or bullies his staff into innovating, or he is very supportive, she is very supportive and lets people do that. But basically it's teams that are able to operate relatively autonomously from the market that tend to produce the best kind of innovation. So that's what I think we need to think about. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting work, I think, in the last 5 years about public sector innovation. And the question is, how can we do that in the realm of communications and technology? And this is getting a little bit beyond media, I think.
Yeah.
But I think that's what we should be thinking about.
No, it's very, very closely related, and it's very important. And so I've got a question here from Gregory Flores on YouTube. He says, what do you think is the current relationship of the BBC with privately owned newspapers, and how would that change with a more democratized BBC? And that is quite an important thing now, what with anonymous source being the most prolific journalist in Westminster at the moment.
Yeah, so there's two things, right? The anonymous source stuff is sort of wrapped up in the wider kind of culture of British journalism, and to an extent journalism everywhere, where you tend to get reciprocal sort of relationships between political elites. They trade in gossip and inside knowledge and the rest of it. And this has basically led to a kind of journalism which essentially involves reporting things that you're told in a WhatsApp conversation, because the people who are in your phone are very important, whereas of course most of us can't build a career out of that. So it's basically just parroting the things that important people tell you and then claiming it as some kind of interesting exclusive. In terms of the specific relationship to newspapers, I mean, one of the underlying kind of assumptions about the BBC since its start was that newspapers, instead of being a concentration of social power in society, represent some sort of like public sphere where their interests and perspectives need to be represented as if they're some sort of bona fide part of public debate. I think that whole premise is kind of absurd. If you look at particularly organizations like the Daily Mail, the Express, the Sun, the journalistic values there are just kind of embarrassing, and it's difficult apparently for working journalists to say anything bad about other journalists. But I think we're all familiar with what these organizations are. The BBC just doesn't reflect that. So, I mean, there's sort of historical reasons for this. I mean, when the BBC started, the press pushed back against the BBC because they didn't want them to restrict their business model, and there's always been a sort of jostling around the BBC and the private press ever since. And it's partly the fact that Ofcom, which now regulates the BBC, everything the BBC does, it has to say whether it's like impacting on other private interests. And there's lots of things going on here. But basically, I think the newspapers particularly need to just be junked as a source of legitimate political opinion. It doesn't mean it's not newsworthy what they say, but it has to be reported in that context. So it'll be fine to say the Sun, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, has attacked Labour, and explaining the political context of that. But that's not how these things tend to get reported. That problem's bigger than the BBC, I should say. But I actually don't think you shouldn't even need a reformed BBC for the BBC to have that relationship to the press. You know, it's just the exercise of due impartiality should really call into question any use of these newspapers. But it's just, the BBC is just bound up in that kind of elite culture. Needless to say, I don't think that would have any part in a short answer to the question. I don't think that should have any part in a democratized BBC, because I think, you know, your conception of like how democracy operates would be very different.
There's a question I have, and you see it quite a lot, is how important do you think separating the BBC's news output from its more traditional programming, how important do you think that is? Because I would see that as something that may be quite helpful, because it then takes away, because the BBC, rightly or wrongly, gets its reputation damaged by its political reporting than, you know, normal programming just that we all watch every day. So do you think do we need to have a separation of the news and political output from the organization of itself, or should we have a completely new, away from the broadcasting side of things, new organization with, like you say, not with it's a charter but more, you know, regulated? What's your thoughts on that?
So I think, analytically speaking, you're absolutely right. You do need to separate the things off. I think in terms of like a program for reform, I think not. I think actually there are problems with the cultural production as well that we want to address, and I'll explain why. Basically, the BBC is obviously it's a huge organization, and it does lots and lots of different things. It does cultural output, documentaries, dramas, and so on and so forth. But also there's just very different types of journalism, different types of outlets. So, you know, if you listen to Radio 4, that will be very different to, you know, Radio Ulster, for example, which, you know, they've had me on, and we could almost, I mean, there'd be a slight exaggeration, but we could almost have this discussion on Radio Ulster. They're very reasonable, very open to scholarly debate. There's just no chance in hell that we would be able to have 5 minutes of this conversation on Radio 4, because you'd be immediately shouted down by people who don't know what they're talking about. And that's the prevailing culture on Radio 4, because it's the most politicized section of the BBC. It tends to be targeted by complaints. It's also the most prestigious, so they have the elites on. So basically there are parts of the BBC which are just much more politicized and much more focused on political pressure. Those are the less free parts of the BBC, where there are things you just can't say, and they're also the worst parts of the BBC, because they tend to distort reporting. Now, in terms of like the rest of the BBC, you know, there are political parts of the BBC, local radio, where they will be much more free in what they can do and say, but they don't have as many, they just don't have the kind of resources and the prestige to have the kind of guests or to have the kind of impact that they want to do. And there are documentaries, say, which don't tend traditionally to be criticized by like Spin Doctors or Number 10. So, you know, you can have much more diverse kind of representations of views in those areas of the BBC. So it's a variated organization. It's not like you know, and it's complicated. However, there are big problems with the cultural production side of things. So it's still not very representative of the society that it serves. It's supposed to represent the whole of the UK and all its diversity and all of the UK's communities. It tends to represent be quite good at representing like the sort of southern middle classes, and this is again like this is the right wing critique of the BBC. I just think it'd be foolish to deny that that's the case. It's been sort of center of gravity for the BBC since the earliest days, and it's changed a lot, but not as much as I think people like to think. And the other thing is that a lot of the content that you see on the BBC is actually produced by the private sector. So if you see something on the BBC, you'll notice that it will have logos at the end and the beginning alongside the BBC. So the BBC, like a lot of its content, gets commissioned from the private sector, and it's commissioned by the BBC, and they have a sort of an element of oversight, and there are the kind of values that get embedded into program making, particularly in like kids programs and stuff like that. But a lot of what you see on the BBC is coming from big corporations. So like what happened there is that in the 1980s, the Thatcherites wanted to create a market in broadcasting, and they figured out they couldn't really do that because there weren't enough private companies producing programs. They said, well, what we should do is we should take the BBC's funding, we should give some of that to private companies, we create a market, and then eventually we can get rid of the BBC and we'll just have a consumer market, which was kind of absurd. But like what actually happened was you had a increasing corporate consolidation in the private sector until these big media multinationals were owning a lot of the big showbiz content. And so now we have this commercial wing of the BBC called BBC Studios, which is producing all of this content, which basically acts like a big multinational media production company. So when they talk about competing with Netflix, they're not talking about competing in terms of program quality, they're talking about competing in international markets with these big companies. Now, there may be things you want to make for good reason with huge budgets. What I would like would be you open up the talent of people in the UK who can't get jobs, who can't tell their own stories, who can't make good programs. And rather than just having this concentration of creative energy basically around these huge commercial production companies that really, it's not that everything they produce is bad, but like there's just a lot of dross, because that's what markets do. Markets just create risk averse content, and they tend to homogenize, and they tend to stifle creativity and innovation. So I think that all needs to change. So that's a bit of a long answer to your question, but like the reason I say that is that I actually think I talk a lot about journalism, but I think there's also a really exciting opportunity if we were to create a public platform to democratize cultural production, which I think has to be a really important part of any left project. And it's about us understanding each other and understanding people who aren't like us, and that can all be built into the different public sector algorithms that we can have. But it's also about recognizing that we don't know what other people's sort of creativity is like. It's exciting to think I could watch something and I don't know, I could watch something that's completely different to something that I've ever seen before. Now, on Netflix, it's quite interesting because you do have some good programs on there, but that's partly because they just have huge resources. Because like all platforms, they just capital just floods it with money in the anticipation of them getting a monopoly advantage. It happens with all these platforms. So when you've got loads of money, I mean, you'd have to have an incredible misuse of resources to not produce some good programming, right? But the question becomes, is that sustainable? Is there a form of creative cultural production that isn't based on market consolidation and big companies that could be exciting? I think there is. Like the model would be things like the ITV companies and Channel 4 back in the 1980s, where you had a period of real cultural innovation. I mean, some crap, obviously, but like a lot of interesting cultural experimentation and innovation, but also an explicit remit to represent interests in society that tended to be marginalized. And that was a really important part of the cultural legacy of the new left and the 60s generation that took on a material form and did transform culture in lots of important ways. So I part of the reason I mentioned that is that I think if you create these structures, it can have the effect then rolls out to society. And I think that's kind of important when it comes to culture, because sometimes I can sound a bit like of a Philistine, and I don't want to.
No. So the next question is from one of DiEM's National Collective members, Gabriel. It's, what can a democratic, publicly owned media ecosystem do in the fight against fake news, like what we're seeing on social media in recent years?
Yeah. Okay, so the question of fake news, I mean, I think we need to be a little bit careful in how we think about this. I mean, really, I think fake news needs to be thought of as being a story which people know is inaccurate being distributed, usually for monetary content on social media. But if what we mean by more broadly is the dissemination of misinformation on platforms, I would say that what we would want to do with a democratized BBC is not to just say, okay, now this organization is just going to report whatever people want it to report. That's not what I'm suggesting, right? You would maintain journalistic values, and you'd maintain a requirement, I think, and not everyone on the left agrees with me about this. Owen Jones recently wrote an article saying that he thought, the concept of impartiality was basically meaningless. And I don't agree with that. I think we'd want to maintain those requirements, because if democratization means we have an organization which represents the diversity of interests and perspectives in society, but in a balanced sort of way, right? And now I start sounding a bit like a liberal, but I think that we don't have, the BBC isn't the organization that it claims to be. It does not fairly represent the diversity of interests in society. And I don't think we want to create an organization which junks professional values or junks the sort of notion of truth, basically. Now, I don't mean truth in a sort of grand kind of way. I just mean that certain perspectives are better representations of what's going on in the world and in society than others. And that of course, journalists should report that. Now, what tends to happen is we have an organization which is very good at reflecting things that powerful people say, but very bad at reflecting the perspectives of organizations which should actually have more accurate representations of what's going on. So like scientists and academics, those interests just tend to be relatively marginal in BBC coverage. It's what political elites say that tends to drive the news agenda. We see this going on at the moment with COVID-19. The reason why the medical experts and the scientific experts up the front isn't just an actual public rationale. Obviously, they're being used. They're shielded. They're shielding the politicians, because no one trusts the politicians, right? What the BBC should be doing is looking for and reflecting a broader interest in society. And I don't. Sorry, this is a bit of a roundabout way of answering the question. What I'm saying is, I think when we think about democracy, we have to be thinking about what role we want experts to play within democracy. And I think we need to be serious about the fact that in a democracy, we give public money to people to find out things about the world and create technology to make our lives better. And we need to think about those people not merely as being interests. I mean, obviously, sometimes they do represent interest groups, but positioning the incentives in such a way where we can repurpose that towards democratic ends. Now, I wouldn't go as far to call journalists experts, but what I'm saying is that I think you do need to have a set of regulatory rules which determine output, and they might be looser in a sort of devolved platform, but I think you absolutely shouldn't be reporting anything that you know to be inaccurate. And I would say this to anybody, by the way, who runs left media or whatever. I don't think the left should ever claim something because it feels like politically expedient in the short term or whatever. I think we have to take these values seriously, and that includes impartiality, but most of all, probably accuracy. I would want that to be maintained over any democratized journalistic platform, I think.
Yeah, I think that's important, because I think sometimes on the left it feels more like people want the BBC or any sort of public institution to just become a left reporting institution rather than a fact reporting institution, which is what we want.
That's spot on. Yeah, that's a much better way of making my point. I would add to that, by the way, that we on the left have a political advantage having an organization that's obliged to report accurately. There's a reason why the right says the BBC is biased towards the left. It's because the fact that the BBC has these certain regulatory requirements, which means that they can't broadcast things that are just like patently bullshit, means that the right has a disadvantage, because as a sort of sociological movement, the right has to rely on misinformation and lies. Like that's just sort of tied into what they do, because you think about what is the right? The right is basically trying to sell a narrow sectional interest as being a popular project. So that involves necessarily some form of deception. It tends to involve telling lies about minority groups and scapegoats and all the things we're all familiar with from right-wing media. So it's useful for us. I mean, even if you want to appeal to political self-interest, it's useful for us to be working with organizations that have to tell the truth, because we don't have to lie. Think about the Labour Party when it was under the control of the left in the last election. None of its adverts, political adverts, were found to be inaccurate. 80% of the Conservative Party's adverts were found to be inaccurate. What does that tell you? It's not just that the people who are on the Conservative Party are bastards. There's a structural imperative for them to mislead people in order to build a popular following, and we see that again and again. So I think some of the debates around fake news need to take on board that the sort of nature of the political actors involved. It's not just the fact that Trump's kind of psychotic. It's also the fact that he genuinely does come from a political tradition which just has to lie, and sometimes he lies very erratically and stupidly, but others lie much more cleverly. So like you say, I mean, if you want a public organization that is just a left-wing organization, I mean, not to want to sound melodramatic, but you're sort of getting into sort of Stalinist territory there, where we decide what the line is, and then that becomes the organization, or like it has to represent the working class, not the other interests in society. I don't think we need to get into any of that. They just need to do their job. That would be useful enough, I think, for the left.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Doing their job. So, a question on YouTube from Das Gutsbook, I think. Do you feel able to advance any existing models globally which gesture towards your argument for the public broadcast vision you're arguing for, like Indigenous TV, for example?
I mean, yeah, there's a few things in terms of the model. I mean, you could have a look at, like, for example, platform cooperatives, because this seems to me to be, and these are relatively widespread. I mean, the main issue with platform cooperatives is that basically, compared to these large companies, they don't tend to have the same sorts of resources. So we have particular types of organizational forms which are run along more collectivist lines, and there's a long history of that. In terms of media organizations, we have various examples, but I mean, we can even point to the BBC as being an example of an organization which we want to transform in various ways, but at certain times in its history has been much more representative of democratic popular culture. I mentioned Channel 4 earlier. The ITV companies, I also mentioned. So for people who aren't familiar with some of this history, the Thatcher government basically more or less destroyed in the Broadcasting Act in the 1990s an infrastructure which was basically, you had these private companies which were funded by advertising, like Thames TV and Granada and the rest of it, and they had a lot of money from advertising, but they were run under public service principles, and they produced some of the best content, and a lot of it was regional, so it created much more growth, but in the regions, but also much more representation in parts of the UK, and particularly I think like culturally, like the north of England, which has been much more marginalized since then. Much more interesting programs, and the news journalism tended to be more free as well. So you compare, there have been various studies which tend to find that, I mean, not always, but usually ITN, as it was tended to be less dominated by government perspectives than the BBC. So we have various models. I would say some from history and some from forms of cooperative organizations and forms of digital technology. So I don't think it's quite as much of a pie in the sky as it seems, really. Certainly we know that something different could work, but have no delusions. This would have to be an exciting new venture. It is a step into the unknown. The only other thing I would say is that we can even look to private sector innovation in big companies. I'm sort of alluded to this earlier, but like some companies will produce very interesting, innovative content. But again, it's not because they're market actors, it's because they have a lot of resources that are then given to engineers and developers and researchers to then do the work. And usually that then ends up getting monetized. So that has to be taken to market. But that's one of the pathologies of capitalism, that basically all the people who are creative and intelligent and innovative are being pushed towards to be servants of capital, to put it crudely, rather than towards human purposes. So that's what I think we need to think about shifting.
And what are your thoughts? This is just a general question on their current handling of how they've reported like the pandemic for example, Newsnight being forced to apologise because of Emily Maitlis's critical commentary on Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings.
Yeah.
And other examples of just not questioning the government as much as they possibly should have, say at daily press briefings.
Yeah. I think they've, you know, this is just impressionistic. It doesn't come from any expertise. I haven't done any scholarship on any research on this as yet, but I think, you know, the reporting is exactly what we would expect from what the BBC is, which is it's been relatively accepting of the government's line. It hasn't tended to report in such a way that would embarrass the government. You can see that in the shape of its reporting, the questions, the headlines. Particularly, I think it did a very, very poor job in scrutinising the government in the first few weeks before the lockdown, when you remember there was a lot of pressure and questions around the government from people who weren't close to the government, who were basically dismissed, and that led to a delay in lockdown, which seems to have been very damaging in terms of public health consequences. So I think they were very poor then. I think there have been gestures since then to sort of make the BBC appear more independent, but as you just mentioned, Alex, that came with a very rapid pushback from the government and an apology. I mean, I think it's not terribly important, but I think the make this sort of monologue was probably not well put together in terms of something that could be effectively defended. But I think that's sort of besides the point. I mean, really, it shows how easily the government can come down on the BBC and get a response. I mean, when the BBC has reported inaccurately or violated impartiality towards the left for years, it's never received anything like an apology. So, you know, we know the sort of prevailing culture that's in operation here. I think what they're trying to do, basically, they were quite pleased that they were able to make themselves restore their reputation in the context of COVID-19, because the government was putting them under a lot of pressure before that. They were worried about their legitimacy being eroded over you know, the perception they have of political polarization. They basically think that the left doesn't like them because people like me tell people that the BBC is not impartial, and they were quite worried about all of that. So I think they saw an opportunity with COVID-19, and what they're trying to do at the moment is balance trying to look independent of the government whilst not trying to upset the government, which is just the story of the BBC, basically. There's some other elements in play, which is that the scientific expertise and medical expertise has sort of been absorbed into the state in terms of these official announcements. And I think the BBC has responded quite badly in some ways to representing the diversity of medical and scientific expertise in society, and is sort of treating these government employees as if they were the voice of the scientific community rather than being members of the government who come from scientific backgrounds, which is an important sort of distinction to make. Lots of other things going on as well. You know, the Labour Party's gone through a period of transition, which was, I think, sort of politically disorientating and weakened some of the scrutiny, and some of that would play out through what the BBC is doing. But that's all just very impressionistic, really.
No, I'd agree. They do seem to have, in more recent, the later stages of the pandemic so far, done slightly more pushback. And you know when they have, when you see Twitter light up with, oh my God, the BBC have challenged the government, because it's that uncommon now for the BBC to really push them back. And like, I've experienced that once myself, and it was from a local BBC reporter when he was reporting on universal credit, and he's disappeared from the BBC ever since. He did a highly critical report on universal credit in the government, and he doesn't work for the BBC anymore. That happened very quickly, and we never heard anything of it again. But that moves me on to my next point about the sort of your devolving things, whereas our content needs to be more all devolved, so we can use, like you said, to get that different cultural and regional sort of pictures of things, like you said, not just in news but in programming in general. You know, it's like, when it comes to Scotland, this has always been, people in Scotland feel very abandoned by the BBC, and we're meant to now feel grateful they've given us, you know, to BBC Scotland, which is mostly England stuff, but you know, we get two news programs for an hour, and we're meant to feel grateful for that. And it feels like devolving things and giving local reporting needs to take more of a what's the word? I can't think of the word. You know, become more to the forefront and then be drawn into the national picture, rather than at the moment everything orbits around certain political journalists, you know, and that's all we'll get. We'll get them reporting. We need a bigger, diverse opinion and picture, you know, factual, but I think devolution could be one of the most important things, moving it away from a London, Southeast England centric approach. And I think that'll be the biggest pushback you would face from people within the BBC, because that's a big change to them.
They've been, I mean, they have moved towards a certain amount of devolution at the BBC. I mean, you know, you mentioned the situation in BBC Scotland. There have been moves to Manchester as well in terms of staffing and production. So there have been steps in that sort of direction. I just wanted to agree and sort of underscore some of the points that you made, really, about the importance of devolution, because it's not just, oh, you know, this is a bit London centric, you know, and it's not just a cultural thing, although, as I said earlier, I think that's really important. There is a political aspect to this, which is basically the infrastructure of the BBC is just a parallel infrastructure to the structures of power in the United Kingdom. You know, there's a reason why it's so central in London. It's because that's where the core of like capitalist and state power is, and you know that's been obviously complicated in various ways with political developments in Scotland. But that's why the BBC is where it is, and that's why the BBC stories, you know, routinely, what is a news story? I mean, it's coming from those interests, right? It's what Hall called primary definers. They're the people who are creating the interest in the news in society, and the BBC are the secondary definers who are following it. Why do they send people to the north of England to report from a place that fits into a particular story that's being politically driven from Westminster? You know, this is just not a normal thing. Like, there's no way you would, if you were going to build a serious news organization, you'd start like that. And like you say, it's about the stories being actually created from what's going on in society, then feeding into the central news structure, right? And that would give people a sense of what's going on. But also, people who work locally are just much less able to be sort of politically blackmailed, because basically if you're in London and you're dependent on the power structure in order to get your stories and your content, then obviously that leads you towards certain ways of reporting and certain professional relationships. And it's very difficult for journalists to be honest about this, but like, this is the bread and butter of journalism, is having good sources. Now, we know what happens with these organizations. Now, if your dependency as a journalist is tied up with that, then you're just not able to you're not able, but you just don't have the information, you don't have the sources, you don't know what's going on, right? So people who would work if it was more devolved, it would be much more difficult. You wouldn't get that element of elite capture, and as you say, it would also be much more culturally and politically represented, the whole diversity of the UK. And I think that's why I usually sort of emphasize this idea of like having public broadcasters around the world also as part of a network. I start sounding a little bit sentimental now, but like, I like the idea of people having the opportunity to know what it's like for people who live in very different circumstances to themselves. I mean, that's what culture and like fiction say, or like culture is really about. It's about stepping out of your own circumstances, but we should be able to do that with journalism as well. It's about learning something new in the world, and that has to be about, like, you know, I grew up in London, so for me, like, you don't get from the BBC any sense of the sort of diversity of the country that you grew up in. And then if you grow up in Scotland, you end up knowing a lot about London and all the people running it, because that's the nature of an uneven state. And you know, that's the big problem with the UK. So in the case of the UK, I think we're dealing with a problem of concentrations of power, and we need to think about arranging the BBC more accordingly with that. But yeah, internationally, I like the idea of being able to, you know, access programs made in all around the world by other public broadcasters and be able to exchange culture and have that subtitled or whatever. So, and be able to explore that through algorithms that just aren't commercially driven. I think that's quite a nice idea, where you could be like, I want to see something tomorrow, or learn from something which is completely different to anything that I've seen. That's the opposite of what commercial platforms are trying to do, because they're obviously trying to bundle us up into like commercial commercially viable nodes in a big
Yeah.
network, basically.
No, I'd have to agree, and I think BBC Three, for example, although it got moved to the iPlayer and largely dumped, it did a lot. It was probably one of the better places you would see more culture and find out more, because they did these documentaries. You know, they had their comedy in that, but they would do documentaries on people and different cultures and the different class structures across the UK. And I thought that's why it was so popular with young people, because young people get interested in these things, and it was popular with the left. And then it got consigned to the iPlayer and largely died, and now they're thinking of bringing it back. And it's the same with, if you watch the BBC World output, there are some good programs on that, and I always feel it's a bit lost that it's not more accessible to us in the UK. You know, you've got to go have Sky and go deep into channel 900 and whatever to find it. And
That stuff, I mean, it's really interesting, because a lot of the stuff that BBC does internationally is just better than its domestic programming, because it's just not kept an eye on. I mean, like the political stuff, not just the programs. I mean, I remember years ago I was on holiday in Turkey, and it was during one of Israel's sort of periodic invasions of Lebanon, and I think it must have, when would that have been, 2006, 2008, I can't exactly remember the details, but anyway, they had their equivalent of the BBC Middle East equivalent of Question Time, and they had, the guy from the left and the guy from the right there, and the right wing person was like, oh, I don't deny Hezbollah has an inalienable right to protect itself against the aggressive army or whatever. That was the if you wanted to enter the debate on the BBC, you had to accept Hezbollah's right to use violence against the occupying forces, right? And I was just like, completely aghast. Like, how could you? This is the BBC, and of course, it's because, like, if they try to pull the kind of shit that the BBC pulls on people in terms of understanding the Middle East to Middle Eastern audiences, they just get laughed out of the room, because, like, the people know what's going on, and so it's a very different sort of picture. And the World Service as well. Like, I mean, the World Service, obviously, it's not going to be good on, like, British foreign policy particularly, but it tends to be much more free, much more interesting, much more creative than, I mean, a lot of the stuff that you see on BBC domestic radio. So, a lot of the, I guess, old public service values are quite well represented in that kind of content. But, like, yeah, the thing is with BBC World is that, like, basically what the BBC's done with its international content is it's just sort of said, oh, we're going to package that and sell it for international markets, and then that will be a source of revenue that we're going to plug back into the BBC. And again, that was part of, like, Thatcher's program of reform. So ultimately, we're going to have to wind that back and say, well, actually, we're not going to try and make money out of our content. What we're going to do is we're going to make it free to everybody, like we do the World Service, because it's the public good, and that's going to be good for everybody. We probably should start by saying, okay, we're going to charge some private companies in some places, but if we can, I would say, preferential partnership with public broadcasters, essentially subsidize them with content and with, like, apps and things like that our public media could develop, because we have the resources to do it, and because it's in everybody's interests. So I think we can think very differently. And again, like, sorry, I've gone on a bit there, but, like, the point is that, yeah, it's another example of the ways in which markets inhibit public goods in ways that we just completely take for granted, and there's no reason why these things shouldn't be free, but it's capitalism that's forced us into this, like, bizarre kind of commodification of what are public goods that really shouldn't have, I don't think, should have any role in public media. At its core, really, the values of the BBC are a rejection of that, and it's been so eroded and corrupted over the course of the particularly the late 20th century, that we've sort of lost sight of that, I think.
No, I agree. I like the idea of, like, almost like a world cooperative of public media, just sharing stuff for the public good, because it is so important with us becoming ever more digital. As you say, broadcast is dying, print is on its way out, and it is integral. And as you say, 2027 is the date. And I fully believe what you say. If we don't do something by 2027, the BBC will cease to exist, or who knows what will happen? It'll be sold off, or
the current model that they're looking for, I mean, there were mixed messages after they sort of briefed the press on this after the last election. But what they want, what they seem to want, is the voluntary subscription model, basically. So they say, okay, you can keep your BBC if you want if you like your public service values, you can pay for them, but nobody else should be compelled to pay for it. So basically, this is kind of what Murdoch's always wanted, and people like him, which is that you have public service outlet. It's relatively small and it's supported by affluent donors, or a dedicated middle class audience. Now the problem with that, obviously, is that immediately you lose the sense of the content being available to everybody. So you see, to my mind, like, the problem with the BBC is that it's in its production, it's geared towards one sector of society in particular. It doesn't do a very good job of producing content for young people or for ethnic minorities. But at least everybody has access to everything, almost everything that it produces. So everything's universally available. That's a really important principle. As soon as we say, oh, if you want the BBC, you have to pay for it, right? And it becomes a voluntary subscription model and nobody else is allowed to consume the content. That is fundamentally not a democratic principle. Democracy has to be based on equality of information, and I think equality of culture in that. And as soon as you lose that, basically you have people in society who will be cut off from public information and collective culture. And that's a very, very different vision of what the BBC should be. The Conservatives, I think, there are still people in the Conservative Party who quite like the BBC for its like small c conservative role that it plays, for its UK PLC sort of thing, and like the sort of soft power role it plays for Britain around the world, and various other things. They will try and win out, but ultimately what they do not want is to have a genuinely public organization. Now, I think we do need to do something about the funding model, and that's why we have to be moving away from the idea of a license fee, because basically what they're doing at the moment is they're trying to argue that you need to get rid of the license fee because it's a regressive tax which disadvantages low-income people, which is correct, right? So the problem is that everyone's so sensitive about the BBC, it just won't make any sort of sensible political arguments. So we just end up sort of, liberals end up producing sort of, issuing these sentimental statements about the BBC's public service function and how it offers value for money and so on and so forth, and like they just can't sort of accept any kind of criticism of the BBC. That is going to drive the BBC into the ground. Like, what we need is a reality-based understanding of what the BBC is and how we can reinvent it and how can we address some of the problems with it. If we don't have that, then I agree, like there's going to be nothing left of the BBC. They've been hollowing it out every year for 30 years, and there will be, I mean, I was saying there'd be nothing left worth saying, like saving 10 years ago, but I'm pretty sure now that when another 7 years, there'll be nothing worth saving. They are going to try and influence the conversation over the next few years. The left needs to be able to answer back, and we can't leave that to the Guardian, I'm afraid, because we know if you leave it to the Polly Toynbees of this world, they're just going to start sort of wittering about Attenborough and fake news and things, and it's not going to work very well, I think.
No, and you touched on funding there, and there's a question in the YouTube chat from Nigel asking he would love to see this, but how do we fund it? What model of funding should we be looking towards using?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of agnostic on this, but I'll lay out to you what I've been arguing for and try to explain why. I've been arguing for a digital license fee, which would basically be connected to households. And the reason for I'd like a digital license fee is it's sort of symbolic of the shift that we've been talking about, away from broadcast and towards digital. But also because I don't want people to think about the payment that you make for the BBC as being linked for access to BBC programming. I want people to think of it as being a public and democratic claim on our collective digital space. And obviously I need a better slogan till I'm not a politician. But what I'm trying to say is that you pay the money because we own our collective culture, and we own, and it's not assuming that that should be owned by large corporations. As soon as you say I'm paying a license fee so I can watch X, Y, and Z, people quite reasonably turn around and say, well, I only watch this or I only watch that. It has to be a universal principle. It can't. That won't work unless you can democratize the BBC, because no one wants to pay for people who they feel don't represent them, because that's taxation without representation, right? So I think it could come from digital license fee, which would be pegged to household income in some way. However, that said, I could see the argument for it coming out of general taxation. There's been a movement in the Scandinavian countries away from license fee, and there are different ways you can do this. It could come out of households, household tax. It can be a levy, or it can come out of personal income. The important thing is that it's kept. The important thing is that it's kept independent of the government. So the government isn't able to use it as a political weapon against the BBC in order to shape its culture, basically. On this point, there's lots around the world which we can look to. I don't think there's going to be any controversy about it, because the license fee model is being less strongly defended now than it has been, and even the BBC has been quite open in its consultations with the government in thinking about how it might be funded a little bit differently.
No, that's fine. And I think that's everything that we've got in the chat. And I think I've touched on mostly what I want to. And was there anything you'd like to add before we go? But I'd like to thank you on behalf of DiEM25 UK for coming on. And it's been really productive in that. And it's really something, it's a topic we could probably talk for hours about, because you can expand on each node, as you say, so much. But I think this is important to get the conversation started. And again, thank you for coming on and talking with us. We hope to have you on again soon.
Other things, people who are interested in following up, if you could you can obviously read things I've written. Don't go out and buy my book, because there's a new copy coming out in August, and it'll be paperback, so it'll be cheaper for you. But sometimes they do have sales on where you can pick up ebooks really cheap, so I guess look out for that. My friend Dan Hind has written a report on the British Digital Cooperative. If you Google Dan Hind British Digital Cooperative, have a look at that report. He's done some really serious thinking through as to what these kind of organisation structures would look like. I've done stuff at the Media Reform Coalition, which I am the vice chair of. If you Google draft proposals on the future of the BBC, you'll see a set of proposals that I led on, trying to outline the kind of reform BBC that we've been talking about. So yeah, just keep an eye on developments, and just stay part of the conversation. I think there's a lot of exciting political conversations that can have, and lots of dialogue between people who want social transformation, people who are working in tech, and social movements, and people involved in organizations like yourself. So
thank you then. And just to everyone else, this DiEM25 UK channel is quite new, so if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe, or you like us on Facebook, and please do feel free to join us. You know, if you can't afford to pay the monthly fee, that's fine. But we're not a political party, just to add. So don't worry that it's gonna upset you, any memberships you have. But we want more people. We want everyone to feel included, to be part of not just voting. We want you to be part of the discussion and the policies, and that's what we aim to do. And that's, so if you check out diem25.org, and you can find out more about us there. And if you subscribe to us as well, I'm sure there's going to be lots more content. But apart from that, thanks for everyone, and hope you have a good night.